It is the late 1960s. In public restrooms across American cities, in parks and bus stations, in the quiet corners of civic infrastructure, something is happening that nobody talks about. Men are meeting, briefly, silently, anonymously. No names exchanged, no conversation. Just a look, a nod, and an understanding. The men who use these spaces come from every corner of society. They are office workers and laborers, married men and single men, churchgoers and atheists. Most of them do not identify as gay. Most of them will go home afterward to wives, children, and neighborhoods that have no idea where they have been. And one of them in every room is a sociologist with a notepad. His name is Lord Humphreys. He is a doctoral student at Washington University in St. Louis. He has decided to study this world, a world that is invisible, criminally prosecuted, and almost entirely undocumented by social science, because he believes it deserves to be understood rather than condemned. His intentions are, in a complicated way, genuine, but the methods he uses to pursue them will become one of the most debated, condemned, and instructive case studies in the entire history of research ethics. And the danger he placed his subjects in, men who had no idea they were being watched, recorded, and tracked, was not theoretical. In 1960s America, exposure meant arrest. Arrest meant a criminal record. A criminal record meant the loss of a job, a marriage, a life. Lord Humphreys knew that. He watched anyway. Welcome back to The Darkest Experiments. Chapter 7 takes us into territory that is different in character from everything we have covered before. The experiments in this chapter did not involve electric shocks, surgical procedures, or the deliberate induction of psychological illness. They involved something more subtle, and in some ways more modern, than any of that. They involved watching, recording, manipulating, deceiving, and doing all of it without the knowledge of the people it was being done to. In an age of algorithmic surveillance, data harvesting, and digital manipulation at scale, the experiments in Chapter 7 are not relics of a distant past. They are previews of a world we are already living in. We begin with a man in a public restroom with a notepad, but by the end of this chapter, we will be inside the servers of the world's largest social media company. The thread connecting them is a single question: who gave you permission to watch? The year is 1965. Lord Humphreys is a doctoral student in sociology, a man in his 30s, a former Episcopal minister, thoughtful and politically progressive for his era. He is working on his dissertation, and he has chosen to study a phenomenon that sociologists have almost entirely ignored: anonymous homosexual encounters in public restrooms, known in the subcultural language of the time as Tearoom trade. His motivation matters, and it is worth taking seriously. The late 1960s in America were a period of intense, institutionalized persecution of gay men. Homosexual acts were criminal in virtually every state. Police regularly conducted raids on public spaces where gay men gathered. Arrest meant not just a fine or a night in jail. It meant a permanent record, public exposure, and consequences that could reach into every corner of a person's life. Humphreys believed that the men who used tea rooms were being stereotyped, criminalized, and misunderstood. He believed that sociological data, real, rigorous, humanizing data, might challenge those stereotypes and in some small way push back against the persecution. He wanted to show that these were not predators or deviants in the clinical sense, but ordinary men navigating a society that gave them no legitimate space for their desires. That instinct, to humanize the persecuted through careful documentation, was not wrong. But the method he chose to pursue it was one that his subjects, had they known about it, might not have forgiven him for. Humphreys inserted himself into tea room encounters by adopting the role of the watch queen, a recognized subcultural role in which one man acts as a lookout while others engage in sexual activity, watching for approaching police or strangers and signaling when the coast was clear. It was a role that required presence without participation, and it gave Humphreys a legitimate reason to be in the room, observing everything without arousing suspicion. He did not tell the men he was watching that he was a researcher. He did not tell them their behavior was being recorded. He did not ask for consent in any form. He was simply there, accepted as part of the subculture's informal safety system, while he documented what he saw with the systematic precision of a trained sociologist. Over time, he recorded the license plate numbers of the men he observed. He then took those plates to a police contact, using his access to law enforcement records in a way that itself raised serious questions about the boundary between research and surveillance, and obtained their home addresses. Then a year later, he changed his appearance. New glasses, different car, different clothing, and he knocked on their doors. He had by then obtained a role in a legitimate public health survey, a real study on health and lifestyle being conducted in the area. He used that survey as cover, visiting the men at their homes, speaking with their wives, sitting in their living rooms, asking questions that were ostensibly about their health, but were also covertly gathering data for his dissertation. The men had no idea. They answered his questions. They offered him coffee. They had no way of knowing that the man sitting across from them had watched them in a public restroom a year earlier and had tracked them to their front doors through their license plates. Humphreys's findings were genuinely significant. Of the men he had observed and subsequently interviewed, the majority were married. Most were white-collar workers, office managers, teachers, salesmen. Most attended church regularly. Most did not identify as homosexual. They were, in the sociological portrait Humphreys assembled, deeply ordinary men, integrated into the fabric of conventional American life, who visited tea rooms not as an expression of a gay identity, but as the only available outlet for desires that their social world gave them no other space to acknowledge. It was, as a piece of sociology, important. It challenged the dehumanizing caricature of the tea room participant as a dangerous predator or a pathological deviant. It showed instead a picture of social complexity, of men caught between private desire and public performance, navigating a society that offered them criminality as their only option. Published in 1970 as Tearoom Trade, Impersonal Sex in Public Places, the study was awarded the prestigious C. Wright Mills Award by the Society for the Study of Social Problems, one of sociology's highest recognitions. And then the ethical reckoning began. The criticism of tearoom trade was immediate, sustained, and came from multiple directions. Sociologists, ethicists, and legal scholars identified several distinct layers of violation. The first was the most obvious. The men observed in the tea rooms had given no consent to be observed. They were in spaces that, while technically public, carried a reasonable expectation of privacy, the expectation that what happened there would not be recorded, documented, and published in an academic book. The second was more serious. Humphreys had recorded their license plates, obtained their home addresses through police records, and visited them in disguise. He had tracked private individuals through a law enforcement database for research purposes, a use of police records that, if known to the men involved, would almost certainly have terrified them. The third was the most dangerous, the existence of the data itself. Humphreys's notes identified specific men, their physical descriptions, their cars, their home addresses, as participants in criminal sexual acts. Had those notes been subpoenaed? Had they fallen into the wrong hands? Had the security of his records been compromised in any way? The consequences for those men could have been catastrophic. Arrests, divorces, job losses, public exposure. In 1960s America, for a married man identified as having engaged in homosexual acts in a public restroom, the destruction would have been total. Humphreys was aware of this risk. He took precautions, storing his most sensitive data in a safety deposit box in a different state, using code systems to protect identities. But precautions are not the same as protection, and the risk was not his to take on behalf of men who did not know it existed. A colleague at Washington University was so alarmed by the ethical violations in the study that he attempted to have Humphreys's doctoral degree revoked before the dissertation was published. The attempt failed. The degree was awarded, the book was published, and the study entered the canon, celebrated for its findings, condemned for its methods, and unable to be cleanly resolved into either category alone. The tearoom trade study sits at the intersection of two genuinely competing values, and it is worth being honest about that rather than collapsing into simple condemnation. On one side, the value of the knowledge produced. Humphreys humanized a population that was being systematically persecuted. He produced data that challenged stereotypes and contributed to a more accurate, more compassionate understanding of a group of men who had no voice and no advocate in mainstream social science. That is not nothing. On the other side, the means used to produce that knowledge placed real, identifiable human beings at genuine risk of criminal prosecution and personal destruction, without their knowledge, without their consent, and without any mechanism by which they could protect themselves. The question the study forces us to ask is the same one that runs through every experiment in this series. Does the value of what was learned justify the cost of how it was learned? And who gets to answer that question, the researcher or the people who bore the cost? In Humphreys's case, the people who bore the cost were never asked. They did not know there was a question. The tearoom trade study was conducted in public restrooms in the 1960s. But the questions it raises have never been more relevant than they are today, because the observer's gaze has never been wider, more sophisticated, or more invisible. Every time you use a social media platform, a search engine, or a smartphone application, data is being collected about you with a thoroughness that would have astonished Lord Humphreys. Your movements, your preferences, your private conversations, your emotional states, all of it is being observed, recorded, and in many cases used to influence your behavior without your meaningful knowledge or consent. The terms of service you clicked through are not consent in any substantive sense. They are the modern equivalent of Humphreys's disguise, a formal covering for a process of observation that the observed person would likely object to if they fully understood it. The lesson of the Tearoom trade study is not that observation is always wrong. It is that observation, without the knowledge and genuine agreement of the person being observed, is a form of power. And power exercised over people without their awareness is power that has removed their ability to say no, to protect themselves, to make an informed choice about what they share and with whom. That lesson applies to sociology. It applies to tech platforms. And it applies to every relationship in which one person knows more about the other than the other knows is being known. Lord Humphreys died in 1988. He spent the years after Tearoom trade wrestling publicly and honestly with the ethical questions his work had raised, engaging with critics, revising his thinking, and acknowledging the complexity of what he had done with more candor than many researchers in his position ever manage. He never fully resolved those questions. Neither has the field. The study remains in the literature, important, disturbing, irreplaceable, and irredeemably compromised, a monument to the fact that good intentions and genuine findings are not sufficient justification for methods that treat human beings as objects of study rather than subjects of their own lives. Next time, we stay inside the theme of memory and deception, but we move from a public restroom to a psychologist's office, where Elizabeth Loftus is about to demonstrate something that will change the way the legal system thinks about eyewitness testimony forever. She is going to plant a memory in your mind that never happened, and you are going to believe it completely. That is the Lost in the Mall experiment, and it is every bit as unsettling as it sounds. Subscribe so you're here for it. Leave a comment. In a world of digital surveillance, does the Tearoom trade study feel more relevant to you now than it would have 20 years ago? I want to hear your thoughts. I'll see you in the next one.